So my last video essay was about the Inuit sled dog slaughter. If you're not familiar with it, it's what it sounds like. The RCMP went around and they shot a bunch of sled dogs in Inuit communities in like the 1950s and 60s, and it was really horrible. And I did a deep dive into that whole kerbuckle. This one is another doozy. It is also dealing with Inuit communities in Canada, and it is to do with something called the High Arctic Relocation. So essentially, the Canadian government did another really bad
I am beginning to think that maybe what I did was wrong. Probably not, but maybe.
So let's just start. So I have an introduction to Inuit in my last video, but just a quick recap for context for those who may be unfamiliar. Inuit are an indigenous people of the Canadian North. Inuit Nunangat is the name of the homeland, which stretches across the Canadian Arctic. There's about 60,000 people throughout 51 communities in Inuit Nunangat, and there's also more Inuit that live outside of Inuit Nunangat in the rest of Canada. Inuit Nunangat is generally divided into 4 different administrative regions. Each region has its own regional governing authority and its own land claims agreement. So a land claims agreement outlines Inuit rights and things like that. The first of these regions is the Inuvialuit Settlement Region, which comprises the northwestern part of the Northwest Territories. The second is Nunatsiavut, which is located along the northern coast of Labrador. The third is Nunavik, which is located in the northern part of Quebec. And the fourth and final region, and the one that we'll be mostly looking at today, is Nunavut, which is the only region to be its own Canadian territory, which happened in 1999. So the next context debrief I want to talk about is the relationship between Inuit and RCMP. This is really complicated. I have a whole 15-minute long section just about this whole power imbalance in my previous video, but I'll give you the cliff notes now. Essentially, the RCMP, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, were stationed in Inuit communities throughout the north, and often they were the sole agents of the government in these communities. Although there were a variety of experiences, there were different police officers with different approaches, generally there's a lot of poor intercultural communication and racism. Policies were enforced unpredictably by different officers. There was also a lot of turnover in the postings, so in a lot of cases there wasn't a lot of time or interest on the RCMP's part to gain the trust of the community. And additionally, Inuit were expected to help care for the RCMP officers, so that was not a small feat in this harsh environment. So in general, this led to a really big power imbalance. RCMP could generally just dictate to Inuit what to do, and Inuit generally, they wouldn't even dare to question the RCMP's authority out of fear. There was also some Inuit cultural etiquette that came into play where they would defer to RCMP officers. And remember, there was also a language barrier in most cases, so that didn't help. And again, I get into this in more detail in my last video, but just as a brief overview. So keep that whole power imbalance in mind when we get into the interactions between the RCMP and Inuit. So yeah, honing more into this video's topic, let's talk about the High Arctic. So today's video delves not only into the Arctic, but the High Arctic specifically. At the top of Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, far beyond the Arctic Circle, there's a cluster of mountainous, ice-bound, and nearly uninhabited islands. At one point, Inuit would call this area Inuit Nunangata Ungava, the lands beyond the Inuit lands. They're also called the High Arctic Islands. This area is nearly the farthest north land in the world, and certainly the northernmost in Canada. So we're going to be talking specifically about Cornwallis Island, which is pretty small, and Ellesmere Island, which is a lot bigger. Ellesmere Island is also the most northerly island in the archipelago. So the first European to kind of bump into Cornwallis Island was Sir William Edward Parry. He was a British naval officer, and he found it in 1819 when he was looking for the Northwest Passage. He named it Cornwallis Island after Sir William Cornwallis, who was a British Army Admiral Navy person. The Northwest Passage, for context, is the name of a sea route through the Arctic islands, and for hundreds of years, European explorers were essentially sailing out in this area to try and find some kind of path through the islands so that they could have a quicker sea route from Europe to Asia. The Northwest Passage is also the name of a complete banger of a song by Canadian icon Stan Rogers, the Barrett's Privateer's Guy.
Explorer, driving hard across the plain, for just one time I would take the Northwest Passage to find the hand of Franklin reaching for the Beaufort Sea, tracing one warm line through a land so wide and savage, and make a Northwest Passage to the sea.
Ellesmere Island, again, is a lot bigger than Cornwallis. It's Canada's 3rd largest island and the 10th largest island in the world. It was named by Edward Augustus Inglefield after he surveyed the island in an 1852 expedition, looking for the infamous Franklin expedition. More on that later. And he named it after some earl or something. Yay, colonial history. Also, I mixed up the pictures of the last two dudes and no one noticed or cared, lol. Now, at the time Europeans made contact with both of these islands, no Inuit lived on them, aside from occasional hunting trips. However, throughout human history, it's generally thought that two main peoples lived on these high Arctic islands over the last few thousand years, the Tuniit and the Thule. According to the Qikiqtani Inuit Association, Tuniit and Thule people lived on Cornwallis Island thousands of years ago, but are believed to have left the island about 1,000 years ago. And the QIA also report that these two people were thought to have lived on Ellesmere Island from about 2,000 to 500 years ago, and that these peoples lived on the island periodically, but for short-term occupations. There's actually a lot of anthropological study in these regions in particular. Because of the cold, dry climates, a lot of artifacts are kept in really good condition for a long time. There have been communities uncovered with houses made of sod and whale ribs, kayak stands, and polar bear traps. But a quick disclaimer first. Anthropology and Indigenous studies as academic fields have a complicated relationship. This is because a lot of unethical anthropology has been done historically. So for context, imagine a bunch of people who don't look like you coming into your community, doing a bunch of studies on you, in some cases taking samples of your blood and hair, and then leaving, taking everything with them, and you also never hear anything about any of it again, so you don't know what was done with all of that they took from you. The field has modernized a lot since those days and become way more ethical, prioritizing people being informed, giving their consent, being more active participants in research, and seeing results of the research. However, anthropology can still get side-eyed by a lot of Indigenous peoples, understandably.
Bombastic side-eye. Criminal offensive side-eye.
So I'm just acknowledging that when we're taking a look at the anthropological history of these high Arctic islands. Now, I'm not an anthropologist, but from my relatively quick research, Tuniit, also called the Dorset culture, lived in the area first, and then they were replaced by the Thule people who may or may not have wiped them out. The Tuniit culture was really different from the Thule culture, and there's not thought to be a lot of genetic similarities between the two, i.e. the Thule were not descended from the Tuniit. However, the Thule people are thought to be the ancestors of modern-day Inuit. The Thule culture was thought to last from about 200 BC to about 1600 AD. People lived in the High Arctic region, especially during the medieval warm period, which was a warm climate in the North Atlantic region from about 950 to 1250 AD. And then there was also something called a Little Ice Age, which happened around 1650 AD. That was kind of like a mini cool period in the world, which may have impacted the viability of people living in the high Arctic. So I recommend looking more into this if you're interested. I had to stop myself so I could actually keep progressing with this story. So yeah, the Thule, not just a brand of those car roof rack thingies. Now, although some Inuit might have hunted on these two northerly islands in more recent times, they generally didn't because it was hard to get to them because of the ice conditions on the southern parts of the island. So like if you were coming up from Baffin Island or something like that. However, the Inukjuak, an indigenous people from the northern part of Greenland, did hunt on Ellesmere Island fairly regularly, both in recent times as well as within the past few centuries. And mostly that seems it's because it's easier to cross over from Greenland to Ellesmere Island than it is to come up from the south. It doesn't sound like Inukjuak live there. They would just hunt there sometimes and then go back to Greenland. So keep them in mind because it'll come up later. So in 1576, British poofy boy Martin Frobisher landed on Baffin Island and claimed it for England when he was looking for the Northwest Passage.
The Northwest Passage!
And fun fact, Frobisher was probably not the first European to land on Baffin Island. That was probably Viking explorer Leif Erikson, who called it Helluland, or Stone Island. Do you see how hard it is to not get sidetracked when researching this stuff?
Wow.
So speaking of sidetracked, let's talk about the Franklin expedition. So ever since Frobisher made it to Baffin Island, there have been lots of explorers continuing the search in vain for this fabled passage.
The Northwest Passage!
Because again, it would be really valuable to be able to go from Europe to Asia more quickly. So these were ships traveling through the High Arctic from about the 1600s to the 1800s, and as you can imagine, it wasn't a super nice time for those guys. There was a lot of sea ice up there, so depending on the time of year, ships got crushed by the ice, they would get trapped and stranded in the ice, they would get lost, the crew would get scurvy, the crew would starve, sometimes they would eat each other to survive. It was pretty wild. And generally, the most famous of all these journeys was the doomed Franklin expedition. So ever since I saw a picture of the preserved corpse of Sir John Torrington in a book when I was a child, the Franklin expedition was my Roman army. I'm not going to show you that particular picture because it's pretty gnarly. It's of a dead body. But it was a big deal when it was discovered in 1984 because not only did it kind of shed some light on what actually happened on the expedition, it was really, really well preserved due to the Arctic permafrost. So fun fact there. You might be familiar with the tale of the Franklin expedition also from the first season of the TV show The Terror, which covers it. But a brief recap, essentially, in 1848, there were two ships led by Captain Sir John Franklin, and at the time, the ships had state-of-the-art technology. They were thought to be Britain's best shot so far to find the Northwest Passage, and they set sail into the Arctic waters and they disappeared. So the reason that this journey is so famous now is because a bunch of modern studies have been done in the vicinity of where the ships were thought to have disappeared, where the expedition took place. And since about the 1980s, I think, they have been finding bodies and artifacts, and they eventually found the shipwrecks in 2014. These findings wouldn't have been possible without Inuit testimony. They assisted researchers with finding everything because they were already aware of where a lot of these things were. The findings of all of this stuff kind of showed that the crew didn't die quickly. Essentially, the winter of the expedition was unusually harsh, and that combined with the slow pace of the ships because they were reinforced with like metal hulls to protect from the ice, and they had all this extra stuff to help the crew survive, that made them really heavy, and they got stuck in the ice for an extra year longer than they meant to. So a lot of the crew starved to death. They were stuck on a ship in the sea ice, and the part that interested my weird child self is because old-timey food preservations were crazy. They sealed their canned food with lead, so along with the hypothermia, the scurvy, and the starvation, they were suffering from severe mental and physical impairments from lead poisoning. This is all totally relevant to the video topic because they traveled through the High Arctic, see these islands? Oh, and then a Norwegian explorer named Roald Amundsen did eventually find the passage in 1906. Okay, back to Frobisher. He did the thing, and then the United Kingdom claimed authority over the whole group of Arctic islands. So we jump ahead to 1880, and Britain didn't want the islands anymore, so they gave control over this territory to the new baby country of Canada. Basically, Britain didn't want to deal with the land themselves because it was kind of a pain in the butt to maintain authority over the land, but they didn't want the stinky, rebellious America to get it, so that's why they gave it to Canada. So for context, this is about 36,000 islands in total, and Canada was reluctant to take on this authority because, just think of all of the paperwork. Most of the work maintaining control over this territory was basically having people on it who walked around and told everyone that the land was Canada. So to do this, a bunch of Royal Canadian Mounted Police posts were established throughout the territory. To learn more about the RCMP and their presence in the Canadian North, check out my last video. And in establishing and maintaining these postings, they sought help from the Inukjuak. Remember the Greenlanders who would hunt there. Yeah, so the early stages of RCMP gaining their footing in this area, they hired Inukjuak as guides. So, no joke, in the High Arctic, a large part of the RCMP's job at these postings was to patrol around and lay down plaques that declared the land as part of Canada.
I declare
Canada.
Hey, I just wanted you to know that you can't just say the word
Canada
and expect anything to happen.
I didn't say it, I declared it.
It's totally ours because of this cool plaque. And also, if the RCMP did happen to run into anyone up there, usually a whaling ship or something, they would be like, FYI, this land is Canada, I declare it. So things continued this way until about the 1920s, and by that time there were 3 RCMP detachments in the High Arctic. 2 were on Ellesmere Island and 1 was on Devon Island. So in 1920, even though the RCMP had a positive relationship with the Inukjuak, they found Inukjuak hunting on Ellesmere Island, and the Canadian government didn't like it. They contacted the Danish government, since Greenland is a territory of Denmark, and the Danish government said that the area was no man's land. Now, Canada wasn't a fan of that because they wanted to maintain that this island was in fact part of Canada. So they said that the Greenlanders were poaching polar bears. As a result, Canada increased the RCMP presence in the area, and this was by many accounts a rough posting. It was harsh territory to live and work in, and there was a couple not so great stories that I found. One RCMP named William Stevens accidentally shot himself. Another constable, Victor Maisonneuve, committed suicide. So it's notable that without the Inukjuak helping them as guides, the RCMP wouldn't have survived. I find it cruddy but not surprising that the Canadian government was using Inukjuak as kind of scapegoats for kind of blaming their hunting on the island as this big issue.
No, I don't know what I expected.
An Inukjuak named Nunangat, in particular, pictured here, is lauded as the greatest guide of them all, so I thought that was cool. He accompanied a lot of expeditions both in Greenland and in the Canadian High Arctic. In the 1930s, Canada's claim of these Arctic islands was becoming a lot more recognized, specifically by Norway and Denmark, who had previously been questioning Canada's legitimacy in this claim. And this claim was even more cemented in the 1940s during and after World War II, when people started paying more attention to this region for its strategic location. However, during the Cold War, when the United States completed a bunch of projects in the Canadian North, with Canada's consent and cooperation, there was a lot of concern that the United States might start to think of the land as its own. So, for example, America was building weather stations, radar stations, a distant early warning line or a dew line, and for all these projects that they were constructing, they were making infrastructure like roads and buildings to support the activity. They had a lot of ships going in and out of the region, supplying the operations. So Canada was starting to get a little nervous, especially for these high Arctic areas. A lot of these places, nobody permanently lived there as Canadian citizens, not counting the RCMP postings. So, what if the US started claiming this territory as its own? They had a lot more people there. Canada was nervous, and they wanted to assert their authority over the islands. Now, let's talk a bit about the historical relationship between Inuit and Europeans, and later the Canadian government specifically. Now, I did touch on this in my last video, but I'll give a little bit more context here as well. Historically, contact between Inuit and Europeans traces back to the 17 and 1800s, maybe a little earlier than that, mostly because of whaling ships in the Arctic region. And as you may predict, because it happened all over the rest of Turtle Island, this contact brought a lot of diseases to Inuit, which had a devastating impact. But eventually, trading posts spread out all over the Arctic, and these trading posts were largely operated by the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company, or HBC, is a trading company in Canada. Now they sell like department store stuff. It still exists. It's actually the oldest company in Canada, and they're known for having those blankets with the colors. But back then, they just traded furs. They mainly dealt with fur trading. They started in 1670, and because of the fur trading, they interacted a lot with the Indigenous peoples in Canada, particularly in the north. And for a time, they were the only European presence in a lot of areas. They acted like the de facto government for a while. Now, you could probably do a whole video on the HBC and how it impacted Indigenous life, because as you can imagine, exploitation happened, big surprise, but I have to stay on task, so let's focus back on the Arctic. So the HBC set up trading posts throughout the Arctic. They spread some lethal diseases, The Great Whale River Trading Post opened in 1756. Fort Chimo opened in 1866, and Little Whale River in 1876. And a lot of these trading posts also had Catholic missionaries who would set up looking to convert Inuit, and they also sometimes provided medical care and stuff. And for a long time, the Canadian government didn't really know what to do about Inuit. They didn't think they fell under the scope of the Indian Act, which at the time really only considered First Nations as Indigenous people. And yes, it is still called the Indian Act to this day. So the federal government didn't really consider Inuit as citizens, I guess. So instead, Inuit largely fell under the mandate of three groups: the Hudson's Bay Company, the RCMP, and the missionaries. So essentially the mindset was like, these Inuit need white people to take care of them. Who will do it?
Over the last century, the government has virtually ignored the North and left the administration of its 9,000 Inuit inhabitants to three groups: the Christian Church, the Hudson's Bay Company, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The one with the greatest influence on Inuit daily life is the Hudson's Bay Company. For decades, the Inuit have lined up at Hudson Bay trading stores to do business, and the company has made its fortune off the fur trade.
So from this point on in the video, I'm going to be using clips from a couple different documentaries. The first is called Broken Promises, directed by Patricia Tassinari, and it's from 1995. The second is called Exile. It's directed by Zacharias Kunuk, and that came out in 2009. Fun fact, Zacharias Kunuk also directed The Fast Runner, which is an award-winning film, and it topped the CBC's list of the greatest films directed by Canadians, and there's a lot of really good films on that list, so that was pretty impressive. So from the 1920s to the 1950s, Inuit life changed a lot because of these presences in the Arctic. Fur trading in particular changed their way of life, because instead of subsistence hunting, a lot of people would switch to hunting for furs, selling them to the HBC, and then using the money to buy goods at the trading posts. So they're switching into participating in the wage economy instead of hunting and harvesting.
For the company, fur trapping is the most important part of Inuit life. It measures the Inuits' ability to survive off the land by the number of pelts they bring in and the amount of credit they have to spend at company stores. But that's not the way the Inuit see it.
In those days, we did not depend entirely on the Hudson's Bay. We were living out of the land, much more than we were getting our supplies. We used to go to the Hudson's Bay store to get a flour, tea, those little things. But they were not our main food. We survived from the land. We've been surviving from the land for centuries. And at that time, in the 1950s, we were still nomadic people.
So Inuit life was traditionally nomadic. They moved around to follow food sources. During this time, it gradually became more settled because Inuit were moving closer to these trading posts. But the problem with being involved in a bigger economic system is now a bunch of nervous bankers in America somehow impacted the lives of Inuit people in the Arctic, thousands of kilometers away. So in 1929, the stock market crashed. I don't know much about that sort of thing. There is something called a Wall Street, and then a man in a suit yells a lot, and then there's a lot of numbers, and it all sounds very stressful. But this event had the impact of making fur prices plummet, since fur was generally a luxury item, and then when the Great Depression happened, nobody really wanted to buy fur. And remember, Inuit would be out on hunting trips on the land a lot of the time, and then they wouldn't know about the Wall Street right away. So after the season was over, they would bring all their furs to the HBC trading posts and be informed that they would now be getting a fraction of the money that they usually did. This was a big problem because they needed the money to buy food. They'd spent all their efforts hunting for fur to sell, because there was the expectation that they could sell them for food and other goods like they had been doing for a while. But then all of a sudden HBC is like, nope, the man in the suit on the Wall Street says fur prices are now collapsed. So that means that you don't get food and your family will starve. And that makes sense to us, the HBC, because that is apparently how economy work. And then they probably said sorry too because they're Canadian. Now, not only could they not buy food, but wildlife at this time, particularly caribou, was scarce in the Arctic, largely due to overhunting, and overhunting by everyone, not just Inuit, because a lot of people would go up there and hunt, like rich people hunting for fun, that's what I'm trying to say, as well as restrictive government hunting policies. So all of this had the horrible effect of a lot of Inuits starving to death. So the HBC then went to the Canadian government and said, hey, there are a lot of people starving to death. Should you, as the government, be doing something about this? And the government said, oh, probably. So they amended the Indian Act to include Inuit, and then they started giving out some government assistance to Inuit, which is a thing governments are supposed to do for its citizens who are starving to death, especially when they caused it. So this started a pattern of the federal government providing inconsistent and reactionary aid to Inuit, addressing short-term relief for immediate issues rather than investing in any kind of systemic and long-term solutions. So Inuit already suffered a lot of death from disease over the years, and they were now experiencing the effects of poverty from participating in an unpredictable wage economy. And they were adjusting from a traditional nomadic lifestyle to a more settled one, which also had its struggles. So, by the late 1930s and early 1940s, Inuit were experiencing a lot of social issues, and their mortality rates were many times higher than those of the rest of Canada. There was also an increase of tuberculosis in particular at this time, so let's go into a quick tangent about that. So tuberculosis has kind of a reputation as like an old-timey disease. It used to be a lot more common in like the 1800s and early 1900s. People called it consumption. Now you generally just call it TB. Essentially, it's a contagious bacteria that generally affects your lungs. You get a bad cough, you get a fever, you cough up blood, and it can also settle into other parts of your body and affect those too. It's a pretty lethal disease. It's caused a lot of deaths, like in the Victorian times, like a quarter of people died of it. If you get it and don't treat it, you have about a 50% chance of dying. And in most of Canada, TB is very uncommon, except in the Arctic. The TB rate in Canada is about 205 per 100,000 in the Inuit homeland, compared to 0.5 per 100,000 in the rest of Canada as a whole. So yeah, the rates in the Arctic are 400 times higher. And it's been that way essentially since contact started ramping up in the 1900s, and by that I mean like contact with Europeans. In the 1940s, the Canadian federal government started responding to the TB epidemics across the Arctic because most of these communities didn't have extensive medical facilities. The general practice was to transport people with TB down south by ship to hospitals or sanatoriums thousands of miles away. This still happens in a lot of Arctic communities. People who are very sick have to come to the south. This was and is pretty traumatic for a lot of people because not only are you very sick, you have to leave your home and communities and move very, very far away for treatment for God knows how long. So why was this a thing in the first place? I couldn't really find a super clear answer on that. I found a study that said rates of TB were significantly lower in Alaska, which is a somewhat similar jurisdiction, and they attributed this difference to, in Alaska, they treat TB by bringing care close to home, by training local health aides, and they supervise care in remote communities and established hospitals, where Canada's practice is mostly just to bring people to the south. I did find a report that said that Canada mostly transports patients to the south because they can't convince enough medical professionals to work up north. I don't know if this is still the case, but nonetheless, you can see how TB and its treatment has and continues to be the cause of a lot of trauma for Inuit. So back to the issue of Inuit disproportionately experiencing social issues in the 1930s and 1940s, and also into the 1950s. In 1944, the government had passed the Family Allowance Act, and then later the Old Age Security and Assistance Acts. So because this social assistance legislation was enacted into Canadian law, the government legally had to take care of its own citizens. So it couldn't keep passing off the social issues experienced by Inuit to other entities like the HBC. However, even though the Canadian government was providing social assistance to Inuit like they were entitled to as Canadian citizens, the federal government was of the mindset that the ultimate goal as the government was to assist Inuit in returning to their independent lives. And they meant that in a very condescending, stop being lazy and get off welfare kind of way, not in like an empowering cultural resilience kind of way. So the government was really fixated on the idea that Inuit were now dependent on social aid and that they needed to like wean them off of it like they were children or something.
The Hudson's Bay Company and the government are not as confident about the Inuits' ability to feed themselves. By the 1950s, many Inuit are running out of the credit they need to buy goods at company stores. The bottom has fallen out of the fox fur market, and prices have plummeted from $25 to $3.50 a pelt. For a while, the company extends credit, but it has no intention of supporting the Inuit through hard times. Under increasing pressure, the government pays relief, but it wants to find a less expensive solution to what it now calls the Eskimo problem.
Oh, and a lot of these clips use a word that starts with an E. When referring to Inuit, from my understanding, Inuit don't like being called that word, so I'm going to censor it. You probably already know what it is, and I'm not knocking the documentary for using it because they're literally just reading pieces of policy and quotes from politicians and stuff, and that's the word they used back then.
In 1952, the government holds a conference on Eskimo affairs. Discussion focuses on reducing relief payments by finding ways to keep the Inuit economically independent. Everything from reindeer herding to education makes the agenda. But the main debate centers on whether the Inuit should be assimilated into white society or encouraged to return to their traditional way of life.
And then there is a lot of stuffy bureaucratic discussion where politicians go back and forth about what to do about Inuit like they're children, and then it finally builds up into the actual topic of this video essay. Also of note, they had this conference in the Canadian Parliament, which I don't know if you know where Ottawa is, but it is not near the Arctic, and they didn't invite any Inuit.
Everyone with an interest in the North is invited to voice an opinion. In fact, the only people not invited to the conference are the Inuit. When questioned about their exclusion, the government responds.
The only reason why Eskimos were not invited was, apart from the difficulties in transportation and language, that it was felt that few, if any of them, had yet reached the stage where they could take a responsible part in such discussions.
So yeah, is your blood boiling yet? So moving on to the relocation. So we have Inuit who are experiencing disproportionately high levels of poverty, largely due to a crash in fur prices, as well as dwindling wildlife populations in the Canadian Arctic, so they can't hunt enough to survive on, and a Canadian government who is trying to think of ways to try and reduce the amount of Inuit receiving social assistance. And I know it was the 1930s, but you think they try and stimulate the economy in the north, get Inuit jobs like they hopefully would for any other part of Canada experiencing similar issues. And if they were truly wanting more Inuit to live a traditional way of life, maybe, I don't know, they could support them in that, support the transition through subsidizing hunting equipment, working with Inuit to map out wildlife populations, that sort of thing, instead of just paternalistically saying, we need to wean the Inuit off the social assistance. Okay, go out and start hunting again. So if you're expecting that the government went with a very bad and wrong option to address this issue, you would be right.
Killing is wrong. and bad. There should be a new, stronger word for killing, like badrong or badong.
So we're backtracking a bit to 1934. In the summer of 1934, the government attempted to relocate 52 Inuit from the southern part of Baffin Island to the northern part of Baffin Island. They did so by claiming that there was abundant game at the new location and they promised a better life for Inuit. However, in 1936, 2 years later, reports say that Inuit were returned back to their original communities because it proved too difficult to move supplies and other necessities to the new locations. So this is the only kind of early relocation that I found a fair amount of documentation on, apart from the main one that took place in 1953, which we'll talk about a lot later. But allegedly, the government did this. They did this in 1934, and they probably did it a few more times at smaller scales, so smaller groups of people and smaller relocation distances. There's just not great records kept of everything. I found a report that said some Inuit found themselves relocated 4 times in a dozen years. And in 1940, an Eastern Arctic Patrol report stated as follows: the migration northwards of Inuit families inaugurated in 1934 has been a success and continues to be popular. 29 men, women, and children migrated from Frobisher Bay to River Clyde, 15 from Cape Dorset to Arctic Bay, while 38 were transported on the Nescope to hospitals to join relatives in more favorable hunting areas. So you'll notice that this is different from what I said earlier. It doesn't report that the families went back to their homes on Baffin Island. You'll also notice the pattern of moving Inuit more north. More on that later. So yeah, this relocation happened, probably others did too, and there's mixed messaging on the details, and it doesn't seem like they went well. We don't know many details on the logistics of these early relocations either, but spoilers, we'll learn a lot more about the one that happened in 1953. Now, as we talked about earlier, after World War II, things got a lot busier in the Arctic. A lot of Americans were stationed from Alaska all the way to Greenland, working on northern defense projects during the Cold War. Notably, not very many Inuit were employed, even in unskilled or semi-skilled jobs, and there was a lot of jobs available for all of these projects. You'd think that Canada might want to encourage them to hire some of the local people experiencing a lot of poverty, but I don't know, maybe not. Anyway, Canada is nervous about their authority in the Arctic, particularly the High Arctic, which in some cases they didn't even have any citizens living on these islands. And as they say, possession is 9/10 of the law. So Canada could declare what was Canada all it wanted.
That you can't just say the word Canada and expect anything to happen.
But when another country has all these developments and all these people stationed on the land and you don't have anyone living there, you can see where this is going. Some of these American military bases were already near existing Inuit communities in like the lower regions of the Arctic. A lot of these military personnel saw the conditions that many Inuit were living in. A lot of communities didn't have access to schools or healthcare. I guess the government was trying to make them more independent. They were recovering from the fur price crash. They were experiencing dwindling wildlife populations in a lot of areas, and a lot of people were starving. And rightfully, the Americans condemned the Canadian federal government for allowing their own citizens to live like this without providing more assistance. So I actually opened with this in my last video, but Canadian author Farley Mowat spent some time living with Inuit in the 1940s, and he published a few books about this. In 1952, he published People of the Deer, which described the plight of many Inuit and pointed out that they were starving because he saw it while he was living there. The group of Inuit he traveled with was relocated 3 times, each to an expanse of land with not enough wildlife to support them. Mowat was critical of the Canadian government, assigning blame for causing these poor social conditions and failing to offer relief. After People of the Deer was published, the Prime Minister at the time, Louis Saint Laurent, received hundreds of letters from people internationally about the government's treatment of Inuit. The book's factuality was debated in the Canadian House of Commons, and a lot of politicians called him a liar. However, as more truths were uncovered, Mowat was vindicated. So who knows how many smaller, less documented relocations took place that, didn't have a book published about them. But now we're getting into the main relocation that was well documented, that was clearly orchestrated by the Canadian government. Despite the failed 1934 Baffin Island relocations, another High Arctic relocation was proposed in the 1950s by the Canadian federal government. The official reasoning was to assist Inuit in returning to their traditional ways of living. The government set its eye on Port Harrison, which is now called Inukjuak. It's a community in Nunavik located on the northern coast of Quebec, technically a subarctic region. Inukjuak was identified by the government as one of the poorest and most populated Inuit communities, and families that were most reliant on welfare were chosen for this experiment. You know how you're experimenting with people's lives.
You know, I was God once.
Yes, I saw. You were doing well until everyone died.
The families were told that they were going to where game was abundant, even though no comprehensive studies of wildlife resources in the High Arctic had been taken. And the families weren't told about any of the disadvantages, of which there were many, and we will discuss that in a bit. So officially, the government said that this relocation experiment was to help families return to self-sufficient ways. But a cool side effect was that it helped with sovereignty. In 1953, Prime Minister Saint Laurent said Canada must establish active occupation and exercise of our sovereignty in these northern lands right up to the pole. Schrodinger's citizens. When you're not citizens when you need education and healthcare, but you are citizens when you need to act as a human flagpole to assert Canada's sovereignty. So the government identified sites on Ellesmere Island and Cornwallis Island, which we talked about earlier, and the government just assumed that there was abundant wildlife there without doing any studies, and that was where they decided to relocate the selected Inuit families from Inukjuak. They chose 3 sites at Cape Herschel, Craig Harbour, and Resolute Bay, and they tasked the RCMP for policing the Inuit and administering the trade store in these new communities. So that was the plan, and by the sounds of it, there wasn't a whole lot more detail in planning that went into it, and the Inuit families suffered all the more because of this.
The traditional way and the white way. By 1953, the Inuit at Port Harrison have already begun the process of blending 2 cultures. Many of their children are attending school. They have access to a church and a newly constructed nursing station. Some have taken up residence near the settlement. For those selected for relocation, all of this will be lost with the move. Local welfare teacher Marjorie Hines keeps a detailed account of Port Harrison life.
From all camps on the mainland visited the settlement during the month. All native homes have been visited. The standard of neatness and cleanliness is on the whole good. Very little sickness has been reported. Most families have fish nets set in the bay, and fairly good catches have been made by all. Many people have caught young seals in their fish nets. There have been more seals in the bay near Port Harrison this year than at any time since I came here in January 1950. 9 picture shows have been held during the month. We had one get-together for and any others who cared to come, a program of games and dancing, some activity for each age group, including the toddlers and the aged.
Okay, so Inukjuak, which at the time was called Port Harrison, was a larger community by Arctic standards at the time, with medical and education facilities. So how did Canada go about approaching Inuit about this relocation? Well, the Canadian government didn't give the RCMP any special instructions about how to approach Inuit and secure their consent for the relocation. So just for context, from Inukjuak, it was about 2,000 kilometers to the High Arctic locations, and there is only 1,500 kilometers between Inukjuak and Ottawa. So even though both locations are technically in the Arctic, Inukjuak is closer to Ottawa than it is to the planned relocation sites in the High Arctic. So that's a pretty big deal. The government also didn't have any kind of policy on, explaining the different living conditions in the High Arctic, which, as I mentioned earlier, Inukjuak is in the subarctic, which is a very different climate than the High Arctic. And we'll get into the details of that later. But yeah, the Canadian government didn't think this was important to communicate. And also, although on paper, Inuit were supposed to have a choice in the matter, RCMP were supposed to approach Inuit and ask if they wanted to go. They didn't properly communicate that in practice, so when being approached by RCMP, people didn't really understand that they had a choice in the matter.
Shumman outlet cigarette television or lock summer lock summer Taman Ninduk over Hung Pilia to Naman Tavan over on some Mangatakonia to the rock coat. I will learn a over Tarsalun in Napani Utiar Lark Tavanegum and good. They made Allah magamalis mahankalok lungal tayo sakikilok taga angar kamita pulis ni siya kamita pulis hoki kaman ukalok sa maman takwa nukakay nukakalaw ka ma angay pagok pala ilawan no takwa nukakay Allah hatawon dun na hatawon tayo mailiman Relocation hollock summer ningom motai milangan angat sima lokal man aul da ko magyaming o hot ga ko meu tanana naga maligun na network pat ningo hatta ningo magal anan tian anan ni tan nago maligun network pat aul la hatta no halong man tay mel man angin kalwak songale Tisyane, pulis ako lock some at the take my lock the ning of Kunoma. Samutka is locked some road. Tana Ningo Milangan. I pangangat Simaloman. They come up to round and totally. Ningo Malay Pangangat and a rover longer Mwaga. Katamaniak Togazongalit, or had to give the Hanoi on their Marta. Police to Radic Katamat Agata Tuping a night in the middle. I will not have a log of it and at the syndicate. Taimalo Tavanga Utuni Hadlanana Taga and I had to theatre art Lunin. Our little travel to Utaga and to Utaga and the Tower. Our little Tommy locks of Tema.
When my mother's new husband, Batty, our new stepfather, learned that we would be relocating, he came to fetch me as they did not want to leave me behind. Back then, the Hadlunat, the white people, were feared and we treated them as people who were strict and must be obeyed. We would never answer back. At that time, we were obedient like small children.
I first heard about the relocation when the police came by dog team with an interpreter and told us we were leaving. He told my older brother and his wife's family, "There are many animals at the new location and that is why you are leaving." I will never forget his words. He said that whenever we felt like returning home, we could, and he made it sound very attractive. Before we left, we didn't live in this exact spot. We lived down there right behind. My brother Simeone and I left everyone we knew because we had been chosen to leave.
I was 12 years old when we went up to the High Arctic. When the RCMP came to our camp here, he told us that my grandmother was one of those people who were chosen by the government. So my father really had no choice but to go with them up to the High Arctic. When the RCMP boat picked us up, and a lot of our families were scattered all over the land here, and we never had a chance to see most of our families. On leaving this camp, I said to myself, oh well, I'll be back here in a couple of years, so I'm not going to miss it that much.
From a report that I looked at, RCMP Constable Ross Gibson, who was one of the police tasked with approaching Inuit, reports that he considered his role as selling the Inuit on the advantages of the project, assuring them that they would be looked after and that they would have the support of the government. So a lot of miscommunication going on. Inuit were also promised that if it didn't work out, they could return to Inukjuak in 2 years. Remember that.
A telegram from the RCMP superintendent in charge of the Arctic outlines the promise made to the Inuit.
Stop. Families will be brought back home at end of year if they do desire. Stop.
So yeah, the Canadian government really had no idea of the wildlife populations or living conditions at these new relocation sites, and they also showed no caution towards communicating misinformation to Inuit about the project. So in 1953, 7 Inuit families left Inukjuak on the CD Howe, which is a Canadian Navy ship, and in total the journey took 6 weeks from Inukjuak to the High Arctic.
We were not used to maps then, and we didn't know it was as far as it was. No wonder. We didn't know how to read maps. On the ship, they used to say, it is very far. We knew then that it was going to be very difficult to go back.
On the way to the new site, the ship stopped in Pond Inlet, which is an Inuit community in northern Baffin Island, and they picked up 3 more families from the community to also be relocated. The reason for doing this was because the government thought that the Pond Inlet Inuit would help the Inukjuak Inuit adapt to the new sites, because the people from Pond Inlet were already used to living in a high Arctic environment. So the Inuit were dropped off at 2 sites. It was originally supposed to be 3 sites, but because of the weather conditions, the ship couldn't get through to the 3rd site at Cape Herschel, which was near Greenland, so they just went back to Grise Fiord. And in hindsight, the conditions at Cape Herschel were said to be even worse in terms of a lack of wildlife for food, so it was probably a good thing that Inuit were not dropped off there. So they dropped off 3 Inukjuak families and 1 Pond Inlet family, totaling 22 people at Resolute Bay. And then they continued on to Craig Harbour, which is now called Grise Fiord, and they dropped off 4 Inukjuak families and 2 Pond Inlet families, totaling 32 people. And by most accounts, the journey was rough. Again, it was 6 weeks long in total from Inukjuak. They were going through the Arctic Ocean, and the seas were very stormy that time of year. And also, Inuit were not informed that they were going to be divided into 2 sites. They were not informed of this until they were actually on the ship. When the RCMP announced this, the families would be separated. People were understandably very upset. But again, the government didn't take into account family ties when planning this out. Remember, these were groups of families from the same community, and they were not told that they were going to be split apart.
Kita palialak tulugo. Sa natikin man taga outlook tangodlok sumarun taiko na. Our upangaw tune ukuriak tune. Sikap kami tune sikap ngaliak tune ukuriak tulugo tawang inut omin. Sa natikilak sumarun ako. Taiko usinga ako tingin sikitalo temer tukut umiyak wali arta taga tangat talar tutlo homat tunutumun kunmeugat ikiti tawlok sumarun homat tunutumun taga takugilok sutulo hangat tatawilok sutulo sunalama tawlok sumarun kasi antan na umiyaw nattamaralawabun atat mumiyaw niya umiyakalok sumagama tayo umiyaw nattamaralawabun kasi kalok sumbulis ko kalok sumada alok tayo net ang natligo umiyakalay tayo niya kasi magalaw na kanot na ito utok kaya lang may tulalaman Kasi numaya makamalak sumarun. Kasi ani, itchimati limota. Pingasuni ko angot nila lang agata. Lalaw agata. Hanay makanal tunasta. Ingat alak tilta. Makauta lak samakata. Nunadlago pingasuni wakahata. Abiyok kaluta. Tagalikati magumamon. Ilagay chuta. Atangit tugut. Angarugalo. Ningaw kalo. Abiyok karang imulatap. Tikaw lalakajugo. Ilang awal man. Tayo mali. Angarung mga kalakay ko nga. Umalipa mo sa nang buhay mo. Tayo nga kalalang man. Umangikarakalak talago. Sala kaya tawtagin man. Abiyok katawalakata. Ini kaya raga ulit ako sa mali umiyak wami. Kaya lang matlo inuit. Kundi alay mo umiyak o hangan nagtutmiyok uto alay umiyak o nipituin na ulit ako sa mali. Tayo ma. Tapuan to abiyok katawal niyang nitnit. Kuya sa unay yung ibili ako tigil ako sa mali utratan.
Tayo kani.
They divided the families. They divided us like dogs. The women were openly crying as we were being divided up to go to 3 different places.
Once divided, each group is joined by a family from Pond Inlet, who will act as teachers and guides. A total of 4 families are dropped off at the Craig Harbour RCMP post, and the rest head north to Alexandra Fiord. Ice conditions force them to turn back, and so 2 more families are dropped off at Craig Harbour. The rest remain on board with an RCMP officer for the 250-mile journey to Resolute Bay.
As we were nearing our destination, I began seeing great rivers, or so I thought, but these were great rivers of ice, unmelting ice. It was a land of unmelting water. We haven't been told that where we were going would be a land of ice.
So a couple years later, in 1955, there was another group of Inuit that made the journey from Inukjuak, another 4 families from Inukjuak, and another 2 families from Pond Inlet. 1 Inukjuak family went to Grise Fiord, and the rest went to Resolute Bay. So by 1955, the Inuit families that had been relocated to both sites totaled 92 people. So when Inuit were first dropped off at either of these 2 sites, they were dropped off with some clothes, a few basic belongings, and their sled dogs. The land was very barren. At these sites, it was essentially gravel with not even much vegetation because it was so far north. And because the government just kind of assumed that the sites had lots of resources and food based on nothing, they didn't plan for housing or employment opportunities or anything like that. They literally just dropped people off at a barren site and left them there. And again, remember, the community most of these families were from, Inukjuak, was closer to Ottawa than it was to these high Arctic sites. Inukjuak had seasonal changes like southern Canada did. Mind you, it's still a subarctic climate. It was colder, the winter was longer, and the summers were shorter, but it was nothing like the high Arctic where the winter starts in September and continues into April. Oh yeah, and the Inuit were also not informed that in the high Arctic, from November to February, 3 months every year, there's no daylight. So because these sites are so close to the Earth's North Pole, the regions experience polar night. So that means that there's 24-hour darkness because the axis of the Earth is tilted away from the sun for a time each year. So this video demonstrates kind of what that looks like. It's a good visualization. The focus of this video is on Svalbard, but you can see that the Canadian High Arctic is also in darkness as well. So this was something that Inukjuak did not experience because, again, it's in the subarctic and thousands of kilometers away. It is not located past the Arctic Circle. And you think this would be something that the RCMP would have informed Inuit of when recruiting them for the relocation, but they did not. So you would get polar night for 3 months, and you would also get a midnight sun for 3 months, so like 24 hours of night and then 24 hours of day, which is a pretty dramatic thing to get used to. I get pretty bad seasonal depression in the winter, and that's in a temperate area with normal sunlight patterns, so I can't imagine living through such a harsh winter and experiencing a 24-hour darkness for so long, especially if you weren't used to it and it was just like a big surprise. So Inuit at Resolute Bay called the area Kasutik, or place of darkness.
Winter brings the disappearance of the sun and 3 months of darkness, something the Quebec Inuit have never experienced.
When the season of darkness arrived, we had to stoop to see what we were sowing. I missed the daylight and I thought that it would never get light again, and I was scared.
Akagadi katwin kawitu niya raw nami. O kakataraw sa may aka. Tayo man na wito. Aka ko. Kaya tuk ito kasi ko yung ano ka na sulu ko ang naktuwa. Ko atwin nang naktuwa yun. Aka ko karawak tuwin. Tapos niyo siya ulos po. Kuya hapon. Padis ko kalagalutik. Kaba makulo kakatigil. Kakatigil ako sa tikot ako. Kalagay bakak kun atatak kun. Takun nga pala kuno ko. Umerdomi tuktuway amingin ni pitakambat iyusin niya po. Tayo man ano ka tatitaw na lahat sa iman na doktor.
We got into Resolute early one morning, and by afternoon it was blowing snow, and it was empty. When we got up to the High Arctic, I was expecting to see the trading post, the RCMP, the nursing station, the Anglican church, because our life was supposed to improve. When we got up there, I was shocked. It was empty and cold.
Inugi hangitoq tinugun na lang alugun. Inugi hatoq tinugun na lang alugun. Unna minna tisugut, omar tisugut ang matako pa mirogami. Tasan natilalo bulak lo nukhalo ngapiwit aminagi. Timita sukko tigi minagani. Hausit tuminan nakata. Nalonak siyak suni kapianak to suntay melok sumerta hausit tumoyang asekita. Nalunok sa siyakso ni. Oksal niya sa suta. Kayuin na katlaw sa mga ta. Ilawag melok suta. Ilawag ulat melok suta. Tatamasan sa bandingani. Kayuin na lang sa mga ta. O ko ito alam mo yung tutulak sa managat. Yung ito alam mo. Asigo nga kapianok tumon. Ililawag sa mga. Tay ko ako makut. When
I have to speak about my father, I'm sorry, I can't help but cry. No wonder I worked with him all the time. Moving from Port Harrison, Inukjuak was hard for him, but believing that he was going to a better place reassured him. When he first set foot on that land, it was apparent by his body language that he was shocked. He didn't know how we were going to live in such a place. There were so many of us in the family to feed, and since he was the main provider, he got totally lost as to where he was going to find food.
Tayo tapunga pikilang alerta. Uhadla lok samata. Illo halang alaw sultay kani. Nunasigatta. Tanakan sisikumitatamman. Tapungawananganta. Ungillustiu. Tanak toigaloksuta. Kisiano hautiyalumajugut. Tappangannogaarlaarti. Tamawannaatuinlaukunearti. Tasamanganuvummun. Nunaktaalloksamarut. Nunakatnagaturakatinno. Amma huagaaluksinnu huagullertsinaarakkutumaanaagustiutlugu auratsialtennaqartuaraqlu huagullertsini nunaaqtiltallu qannisimman taima qannilortsuni aunniatornolnangiman aputahanginami qannilortsunaaxattusin taimailluusuugumman taavannunavun suna qannitaaquni autsaalangatnaatipivilerto huagugami qannitaaqami apuserto gilirto uvulli ilaqaloqsamiruqamaqaalimming ilitaaloqsamagatta ilnialsigilaartatne qannutaaqtuutikisuugummangaan ilnialsigilaartatne ilitaaloqsamagatta tanna qanuilinganiarmangaan taman taaqtuuvulluni apeqsuagatsutigu ilugaloqsamaruun uqootulaaloqsamat nangan taullalngaluqtiltu taaqtuuniarmangaan kisaantamaanilertuttu salilorsamagatta seqanqaruungitamik akunammaqaaluuraaloqsamaruq ukiorlimaaquraaloqsamaruq taaqtuuninga ammalni tatsuman maannaulumin nillasunimmaqaaluuloqsamman tatsumaniutuluguli mannalunniin igasiut uqsualuq kuvigunnersimulaarmuli huaqmun maannat kalameegunnaatsuulannillasunimmaqaaluoqsamma tatsumani taanna taaqaluartilugu nillasunialoqisiinaat attiingilualoqsamalanga
Tuorluqimmititunaavitertuta.
They dumped us like dogs. There was little light and the weather was already cold. They moved us to a barren land in front of a big mountain. We didn't have any supplies. We had nothing but tents. They did give us buffalo hides, which we used to insulate our tents, but they made our tents dark.
Camped on the shoreline, the Inuit wait for snow conditions to improve so they can build their igloos. But the right conditions never come, and so they spend their first winter in canvas tents. There are 6 people living in Anna Nungaak's tent, including her mother, her stepfather Paddy, and their 3-year-old son, Larry Odaluk.
I remember the cold mornings when we were living in a tent the first year or two. It was. I remember the mornings being very cold, and the walls being very dark. And years later, I found out those were old buffalo hides, which were used for insulation in our tent.
Compared to the hunting back in Inukjuak, it used to be very cold and very dark, and we had been used to hunting in open waters. Now we were in a land that had no open water. We lived off the seal-breathing holes, and when we went to the water edge, it was very dark. We sometimes would wait for hours by a fox turd, thinking it was a seal's breathing hole because it was so dark. After waiting some time for the seal to come up, we would touch the hole and discover that we had touched a fox turd.
If there had been no seals, we would have frozen to death. Thanks to the seals, we were able to eat. We used the seal blubber to make oil for our oil lamps. We would melt the snow with our lamps, wash our clothes. There was no source of fresh water there. When it was very dark, our mothers would fetch ice and they didn't even have bare essentials like a flashlight. They had brought lamps from Inukjuak and they would use them to shine on the shore where they looked for ice.
So, from this testimony, you can see how it was a shocking adjustment for Inuit who were relocated. The darkness, the cold, the lack of food that they were used to. So, in Inukjuak, Inuit regularly ate Arctic char, they had caribou, there were geese, they harvested clams and oysters from the shore, as well as cloudberries from the land. And they didn't have any of these things in the high Arctic, and they had to hunt seal and polar bear, which that's very different and more labor intensive to both hunt and prepare from a lot of the other traditional foods they were used to eating. And remember, they were doing all this in complete darkness a lot of the time. So not the abundant game that was promised by the government. The government also had not stockpiled any food or done any kind of preparation to help the Inuit at the relocation sites, so they had to hunt daily just to survive. And you can see how eating not a very diverse diet, let alone it not being the foods that you're used to eating, can take a big toll on both your mental and physical health. Oh, and in addition to game being scarce, there were also government regulations on the game as well. Sam Willie Elias Saluk, who is relocated to Resolute Bay, stated the following: "We were told right off that you can only catch 1 caribou per year for your family. That's the regulation. Also, you are not allowed to kill any muskox. You are liable to a $5,000 fine or be arrested if you kill any muskox." My question is, why did they even bother mentioning caribou and muskox and the plentifulness thereof when they were trying to recruit people?
The dream of a better life quickly fades. The caribou and muskox herds near Grise Fiord are severely depleted. The RCMP tell the Inuit they can shoot only 1 caribou per family per season. If they shoot a muskox, they face a $500 fine or jail. But the difference in food creates the greatest hardship. In northern Quebec, there are over 50 varieties of land and marine game. In Grise Fiord, the Inuit find only 3 or 4, and most of it comes from the frozen Arctic Sea.
In some cases, they mention how it was even very difficult to get drinking water because there was very little rain, there were no streams or fresh water sources at any of the sites, and the only way to get fresh water was to collect and melt ice. So the Inuit were not provided with any houses or anything. The government just thought that they could build igloos, but they didn't understand that you could only build igloos with certain snow conditions. And because the snow never reached these conditions, Inuit had to spend their first winter in canvas tents. RCMP didn't help them out, other than giving them a few animal hides to insulate the tents a little bit more. And keep in mind, temperatures in these areas regularly reach -40, which, interestingly, is the same in both Celsius and Fahrenheit. And remember, the Inukjuak Inuit came from a community of about 500 people. They had a nursing station, they had a school, they had a Hudson Bay store. So the promises by the government of a better life in the high Arctic, you can see how that's not even a little bit true. Inuit who were relocated reported experiencing extreme hunger at times, something that they hadn't experienced when living in Inukjuak. And the government directed the RCMP to keep Inuit self-supporting and independent. And if police considered that it was possible for a person to hunt, relief would not be issued. One report I read stated that if any given government workers at a Canadian government post were missing any essential items like proper clothing and housing, that the government would definitely sort that out immediately. They wouldn't just establish a posting somewhere remote without a proper budget to maintain it. Meanwhile, the government had no budget to maintain the relocation sites. And remember how Inuit were promised that if, after 2 years, they wanted to return home, they could? Well, that was a lie. In 1956, Inuit requests to return to Inukjuak were denied. There were a bunch of BS reasons for that. Officers stated that conditions in Inukjuak were too poor to return to, and that it would be too difficult to return to, and that it would be too difficult to transport them. Requests that friends and family from Inukjuak to be able to even visit people were denied. RCMP stated that they did not want the area to become overpopulated. And you see, the Canadian government had already been claiming that the relocation experiment was a great success. There is a 1953 issue of the Beaver magazine celebrating a successful relocation of Inuit. And inside, they state that the ship carried destitute Inuit families to their Garden of Eden. In 1954, the Montreal Gazette reported that Inuit families were pleased with their new surroundings, and they all looked happier, healthier, and had visibly put on weight.
What the hell are you talking about?
So, to keep up this pile of lies, RCMP not only forcibly kept Inuit from returning to Inukjuak, they also discouraged Inuit from even sending or receiving letters from their old community.
After made of the eat of anything, Tamakoti to the Raktala, we get out in the Pachuti. Police him a Kamal Jartinan. Amalo Tabanga, Uhat near Trio, not so much now, could Ohal up some Agatlo. They met tuning on a rough daily multiplicator, Agatak Agon, Amishunding. I will not go into Kita Agata. Take qua untuk to side, their force the man is shooting. Into the wonder to meet some time to get our long motor. Take some some dog. I lost the some dog who had locks in the article. I lost the simply her knocked over it. And then locks in the article. Time is a moment locked some road. Come again, tell how now. Or not tumbling Kalakata, Kamakunluni, Lunarostin. The man is a monopoly with our rocks and mere time I out.
Tamano, come chapter, so I'm a Paris kun, Kaisime with your booting, and the Simadonata, another cookata cook, horse hatter or some Paris cook horse evening. How do you chair of some Mangmata Tabu looked up again after in pitching Kutta, Inukjuak, Nagamagata, Akawamako, Hanapati. They made you to the Gakam chest of them. Malo, Tan Aipanga, Hoshurok, Maison, Katiman Narrative, which is our jam in the Takomako. Paris Kunoshurok, Puyokto, Puyokto Jagating, is a Puyokto near Oxamong to show him a Paris, they made on an answer to her Oxamong. Parisico, Unicala Mentana, Nukta beginning after 102 Mangan, Unicala, Puy Maria to Unica Oxamong, whom you dare Rumago, Trigna, Natural Dumia, Pimata. Amaru Rakwa Ataraku in Maha Kanaya, Pigashu, Pigunangatu, whom you dare on up to cleaner, you do on Chanatu. They made of dogs to the Kamayama, Dana, everything after them. Pew Mario to the Unicata or some, should not pursue the chat.
The Roman to tell of food. They come out. I met them a few Salamans in the hot years and along the second Macau. They go Macox and along the Mata. The Panio, I would really mock out. Not pretty amount would allow me to tell me to take Kunako Macun. Tusongot tilo mitik ngal kau. Khuwe pinalo kusibulun tamatu mengatok sutik. Amal umar hamningan utoyan ne hamningan ulu. Pit richu khuwe pinalo tu isunganalo tema. Kisian taman natu tilong ngemat. Aku tahu sama ulun nyati lu. Tikota taku to malila olong retap pelaksong nalong. Iki nalong mat amal umar halawani. Tak tu laksane. Amal tamani luang ni ila wang soalu lutik. Tenak tu long mat uto magasulilok tu galot. Teko kau makukau singa maletsu. Uto malagalong megani anak talong itu. Teman kau makukau salok tang atu tilong. Ako nangi kalok telu tanah naga. Tiang ni ke walabun. Khanga hotelak kata non tentrai mengetrai meliu naman. Utak kasian lau talabat sunga. Kisiani tanna polisi kalawun utak magai makabi kasau laksu. Au kami kisiani kiu di cahang. Umiak otak mereka kau makut. Tusari alu laksu tanna isi kiu nak tawalak tutumani karalo. Tanna ikumalak simman. Aku tahu nak lu. Utak malata. Mana kunneng kutak aku lunneng. Utila aku malata. Tali laksu magata. Oh, kiu tu laksu malu. Tamani kan nak terhalang itu. Ilat sini. Tamang kutakkan tundar ni tawangin doamen. Dari memang angkat berkesian memang cunat. Gunnar tu kalau tamang orang dapat tak. Kesian tamang orang kalau kau ngamata. Lagalok sudah. Tema tundar. Inukjuak teman ini halau anak orang ngamat. Tamani kan tundar anak orang ngamat. Tekuilah tamang kan tundar dulu. Atau seperti apa kalau tu. Lepas memang itu berkesian umat. Aman polis kuno terselung dan mata kau makut. Tahu nak kau itu mewah itu kaya orang itu. Awal lalu tigo kaya orang itu. Dalam orang ini kami kaya orang nak tahu tu makut. Teko kau makut saya mau kalau sudah. Kaya orang ini nanti. Tamau kalau kalau semula aku makut nak tu.
The RCMP officer at Resolute describes a different situation.
To date, the present natives have enjoyed the virgin country surrounding Resolute. They do, however, from time to time express their desire to return to their friends and relatives at Port Harrison.
After meeting with a group of Inuit who asked to return to Port Harrison, a government official makes his recommendation.
I would be inclined to suggest that if any family goes back, that family should pay all or part of the transportation costs.
The Inuit at Grise Fiord and Resolute Bay can't afford to pay their own way home. Without their knowledge, the money they earn trapping and doing odd jobs for the RCMP and the military is being credited to something called the Eskimo Loan Fund. Set up to assist new Inuit business ventures, loan fund money was borrowed by the government to pay for supplying the relocation. Now, Inuit money is being used to pay back the loan. What extra credit they have is used to buy goods at the government store. In March 1955, Minister of Northern Affairs Jean Lesage announces a slight change in government policy. The preservation of the Inuit in his primitive state is not a real alternative, he observes. It would mean segregation, isolation, and denial of the most humane services. Lesage's statement doesn't stop a second relocation to Resolute Bay and Grise Fiord the same year.
It will be moving day this summer for 35 Eskimos in Canada's Arctic. This is a purely voluntary migration. Under this scheme, Eskimos are moved from poor hunting conditions to regions where game is more readily available. The program has been an unqualified success. Although they are free to return if they wish, the response so far has been to urge their friends and relatives to join them.
Now we have to note that these new relocation sites were actually adjacent to other settlements. So Grise Fiord was about 40 miles from an RCMP posting and an American military base. Resolute Bay was also near an RCMP posting. However, the government highly discouraged interaction between Inuit and these non-Inuit facilities because, again, of their weird independence fixation thing.
On a tour of the Arctic Islands, government official Gordon Steed raises concerns about the proximity of the military base.
The reasons for moving these families here is grounded in an attempt to keep them in their native state. Moving them to an area where they come into intimate contact with white men destroys the basis for this reasoning, leaving them untrained to cope with the problems presented by this contact.
At Resolute itself, permission is granted by the constable of the RCMP to bring the Eskimos to the Air Force camp so they could be filmed for television on the sound camera.
In an effort to preserve their traditional life, the RCMP officer at Resolute has been instructed to limit contact between the Inuit and the base.
The natives do not frequent the settled area of the island, only to trade at the animal store. A patrol is made either by foot or snowmobile to the native camp every other day. During this time, all tents and persons are checked. Women and children have not left the camp since their arrival.
I remember vividly that we were forbidden to go there. To me, that was very strange to be forbidden to go near the base. It was the first time that had happened to us, and I never forgot that we were not allowed to go near the white people. In Inukjuak, there used to be lots of white people, especially when the sea lift came, and I remember that we used to mingle with them, even though we didn't speak the same language.
So Inuit were starving in a dark, harsh land. They had no assistance from those who had brought them there. A lot of Inuit reported scavenging from the dump. So that would be the military dump in Grise Fiord and the RCMP dump in Resolute.
Asuila marlukusirpalagatta inihilukaaning nirinlukuvin takuvalagatta nirilaorsulta marlukuni minarpallaorsimvugananakutni tainaulailluanguasuugummigakku saimaqarangiutigisууgummiyara anaanavukaaqqhuutuviniugami hiutsunillu minattinning ahikkiulaviniuqquutuning makuninga asaattuuravinnernilukia kaapivinaалунга tanginnaatillaguin nerijuaping takunnalaorsimagakku upigusutsuninerijo marlukutaariataartatinni taimaaluqitsuta tappikumarluku inneritaqalukaappamat aluqitsuta unnuaqutsipalliorsimagatta poliisialuvini pisuqulivalaorsimangiimma tappaunga unnuaku pisuqattaqulivalungiimman pauna tassiumaanitju avununga taangaangut pisupalliormigatta aqqutikkuupalaoruluarsuta pisuqattaquliungiinta taavununga taangaangut pisutsutaraavijautailsuta pisupalliorsimmigatta marlukusiurpalliorsimagatta marlukuninneqeqalliorsimagatta aqqaagunneqat qatsinikiaqqaagunneq marluku piniñanineqeqalliorsimbugut aksulluunniili
iqutulukaatsugi paungaaluviñiillaapu viñiillu sunaviñumangaatluunniqaurimat aminagit mamaqtuumata panaanaavinerniluneqerpalaugatta huaviñuutsutiluaunnikullersutiqaimamatseerunnaatsuugaluunik neqerpalaursimagatta marlukutaavintini tappaungaalu taima tupaq pulisial tupangiñingani pulisikku tupangiñingiñi uteriaqasavalangammisutta qaaviyaungintini
Tuhangisialaortuq taima tamaan pisippakalaaqsuta tumisillarsumat agatlunnin kisiani sikumman pulisi maqaqataagumavummat sinttaqaaqataagumatsuni Amerikan lupaqataarsuni amaqavallu pulisi tuktusiorauannoq Amerikalugu pulislu mallangammaniing Arilaparnailarannoq maqquyuliaqannoq qannaqattiaqannoq pulisoaqsuni atausiivullugu kisiani sitamaulutaqamatuinni atausiinni 16 qannaqalluta 15 yungutoq ammalu 17 yungutoq 16 kisiani qannaqalluta pulislammat qannimukatimalliungutaalaulaaqtulukaangaagiaqammat Asila tuktohat dengan mahaurimagatta taabunga sintilauqsuta tamaangasit amaagannoq pisutsunoq tuktusiortuutsilangammat tuktusnaangattu haurimatsunoq paisitlugahamatuinni pisutsun tappaunga taqqatuinnasunnoq nururtangana nunaman tuktusnagannanuullangatsagu lagattu kisanaanaq aunasilangatta taimaillaaqsammilugun taannatawa naqatiumman nannuvinerlu natsavinerlu taakkutummaniin uvagulli taavanikkupaimmiuguttula naqaqalniuguttaliqaqalunni ammalu tamakkunanga imarmiutani uvillerni ammuumaluni tamakkunanga qanuutunneqqalniugutta ammal timmiani makkunanga ammitserninnerluni kangorni tainaittaqattagani taannakisiani neqamat nigilaungamaqalaaqsamaru ammalu aulauttiluguli taavani nunamalipeortuhamma paungani makkunanga kimminerni kigutingerni tamaasunahat angammat saluktualuillaaqsamaru inneqamineqeqqoortu inuhtimutumaani liuqat aganta makunanga naqataaqamik aullalaaqsamagatta makuaqimalaaqsamagattagu niuveqqimatsugu ilinniaveqimatsugu tuksiaveqimatsugu aaniasiupileqimatsugu sunaqat agattumuuloorsamagatta taimali marlukunikisiani attavimmik qineriaartileqatta neqilukaartahamman taikkuninga neqilukaagunnasigatta qaurisaugatta puliisimun aksuarsaattaarta tappaangumitsaanduuni pisartahoraagunnaagatta taikkua neqilukaappacuagigattigu tappaungaqasaalerta attavimmitsaanun nulukkuulunuitaaqman pungavatsuta iluqsaaviluani aniguqsiaqatsigu taqqataaqma aikkaneqparta qiliinnasagu attavimmin neqilukaani piqattaloorsimarugut kisiani taanna attaviqangipan perluqaleqquillaorsimaru
Chulu They made us live a life as though we were dogs on a long leash. When a dog touches a person's belongings, the dog is punished by being hit. It was as though we were treated like that, and when the police found out that we were scavenging for food in the garbage dump, he would search our whole house to find what we took from the dump.
When the City Hall came again in August in 1954, we got our X-ray. That's when I was told that I had advanced TB. So I really had no choice. So I went down to Manitoba. When I had to leave for the hospital, I was scared. I didn't want to leave my family, but I wanted to get well. Many of our families had to spend a great deal of time in the hospital. So a lot of us grew up without the care of our mothers. Most of us children were motherless one way or another from 53 to 60.
Over the years, the RCMP keep a record of Inuit health problems.
At the present time, there are 14 Eskimos from Resolute who are hospitalized, and of these, 12 are undergoing treatment for tuberculosis. 5 births were registered during the year. However, 3 of these were premature.
I got pregnant 6 times and I lost all of the babies because of the hardships. When I delivered another stillborn baby, actually I delivered twins that were stillborn. The police heard about this and he came to ask me, "Why can't your children live?" I kept a lot of things in my mind and I want to answer him. But as usual, I kept these things in my mind. What I want to say was, it is because you place us here where there is no heat. I have been trying to make heat and I miscarried these little human beings. But I didn't say anything.
Makayuwatla nakinahsun talimanin. Alahaw ni malaka. Talimanin nakinahsuno. Migigyan niya sa kapit sa tilago. Umarasya ko sa kapit sa tilago. Malikita ka laro ko. Ang nito ako ma. Tayo mo nusak ko taksi malalak tilago tikitukan. Nunatinon. Kinnipi ako pito apin. Ilanat yung nasawit. Nalikak sawit. Tawag nilirot ng tigot. Subigot tigot. Umarasya ko tigot. Tawag nilirot ng tigot. Subigot ng tigot ni. Kahit si mga polisi mo, kamalitin yun. Subigot lang yung tigot. At ataga, pukat na may namasunday, mas piso ko sa kapat sa panelaman. Nakadutak kisiyan yung mata. Kindingin nungutot siya din doon. Pera talo. Subigot siya din na matata. Okalaw simaro. Okalaw ro. Asoy latamanin nun nami. Tukot tayo yak tutumin niyo bukod. Kinamilo ko pisak tagan eh. Inuwa katimin lunit. Kamakuin lunit. Tayo chumanisipan nyo sa kakatlaw tangin ta. Ukago timik.
And yeah, if you saw my last video, you might be wondering, did the sled dog slaughter happen in these communities too? And apparently, yes, they did. This woman talks about it. I believe her. I couldn't find much in the way of written reporting about this, but yeah, imagine you're dumped in a barren, harsh area and you have a few clothes and your sled dogs. And if you've seen my last video, you will know how crucial sled dogs were for survival in the Arctic at this time. And even though that was one of the last things that you had, the RCMP still shot the dogs.
Kami dipingasyon tumiyo sa mga mataran ni utakama to kung ay sun hawnat
unit heading. So that at the very room, Senego Roma, that Kohen Kapingasun, Tohumazu, Ilisakos Medic.
And I don't even have anything else to add at this point. I'm just at a loss for words, so I'm just going to move on. So remember, there were two groups of Inuit among the relocatees, the Inukjuak Inuit and the Pond Inlet Inuit. Now, the Pond Inlet Inuit had been recruited by the RCMP to assist the Inukjuak Inuit with learning to live in the High Arctic, being as the Pond Inlet Inuit were more used to these living conditions to a certain extent. Well, both groups of Inuit were treated very differently by the RCMP. Inuit testimony notes that the RCMP always seemed to be angry at the Inukjuak Inuit for not being good enough hunters, as opposed to the Pond Inlet Inuit, who again were more used to this climate and not from 2,000 kilometers away. They note that the RCMP bossed them around and scolded them. By them, I mean the Inukjuak Inuit. They treated them like welfare cases who were there to be rehabilitated. And the relationship between Inukjuak and Pond Inlet Inuit was also quite difficult. There were cultural and linguistic differences between the two communities, as well as a divide stoked by the very different treatment each group received by the RCMP. But don't worry, the Pond Inlet Inuit also got exploited. So the Pond Inlet Inuit who were relocated went with the understanding that they were providing a service to the government by essentially acting as guides for the Inukjuak Inuit. And as you know, when people provide a government service, they generally are compensated for that service, such as by being paid, or having their basic needs met, or being allowed to freely travel back and forth to their homes on Pond Inlet. However, the government allowed none of these things. Pond Inlet Inuit were also misinformed by the government that there was abundant wildlife in the area, so on multiple fronts they were basically coerced into relocating. And it gets worse somehow, because not only was the government not paying the Pond Inlet Inuit for acting as guides or providing for any of the basic survival needs of any of the relocated Inuit, but they required all Inuit to basically provide free labor on many different fronts. So not only were Inuit struggling with, day-to-day survival, but they also had to act as guides for the RCMP. They were expected to assist with mapping and data collection in the region. The women were tasked with doing a lot of sewing, presumably for the police and the military, and they were not paid for any of these services.
Uniak pasukham tiap hakti tamengano kirna atau siakalasuno imane ya katwena singamo kusala katego ukhmeto le imang mete wini utsune suna pona piat niugat lang mejabu temangin nalimat siakana nakalakina temangat ulutama ilane batsuno mga nanokalakutsuno nanalun na misalanek. Tema amisalin na nawatsap mata. Siya ko ultam na nakalingkay na siya no. Tirigan na kalun. Tirigan na kalun. Kamuti tataas palolo. Tirigan natin anita. Taguloy masulitut sa taka. Inu kinaulor ni kisane man tay ko kinaulor ko ni kinaulor ni nang otita ka makutilli si matuin na mata tilli si matuin na lang tiwi salurang lang nanongalong ko ulul na amisal ni so ganela ko sutlo kay mga lupay suta katong mata ko na sutlo no ko tiyagal ni katong apa ka ang yutingalaning nakayatakan ito pinay. Nakayatakan ito pinay. Nakilo na kumahit sabit takat kagata. O kumahit ito kakalo ko kata sa magata.
Imali ka pala akong magata. Sanang mga sukulok sa taulilak sa magata. Sanang mga tagalak sa matutulok. Tayo ko sanang mga tabot. Pulis yung tigo ka magin. Tuan tala to na imali ka dok ni kinarumin lahat sigani amma nanorta John the Talato on I made the lock from the cage out of Milnuchigane. They go Makone. Pitala Hanatalo, Colonel Levan Teko, Kina Tower locked out. None there would not Hanel Tunamar, no theatre. Police you, pitching the Banamangalo. Now not Hanel Levan as you cut you into winning.
Products from the store used to run out quickly. We went without panic, sometimes for lack of flour. Sugar and tea also would sometimes run out. We used to try to make tea from the plants here. There were no cigarettes either. I used to smoke then. While cigarettes were scarce then, now that they are available, I don't smoke anymore. With nothing up there, not even flour, we used to go hungry and there were no airplanes to bring food to buy.
So government reports that I looked at tried to justify this by saying that they would track credit instead of payment and give family allowances for goods. However, the records were kept by the RCMP and they were not very transparent about what Inuit were entitled to. And speaking of what Inuit were entitled to, as Canadian citizens, they were supposed to be receiving social assistance like family allowance benefits and old age pensions. However, they stopped receiving these after they were relocated. And this part of my research was confusing because the government was really shady about this record keeping. It sounds like they would track any benefits received as store credit instead of giving Inuit money, and they also weren't very transparent with Inuit that they even had this store credit to begin with. And a lot of the time it didn't even matter because the stores were out of stock of everything and didn't have anything to buy anyway. It was all very disorganized and shady and fecked.
By the 1960s, things at Grise Fiord begin to change. Houses and a school are built, and the RCMP post is located next to the Inuit settlement. The people of Grise Fiord build a strong community, and life slowly improves. At Resolute Bay, houses and a school are also built, and a few Inuit men get permanent jobs at the base. After the first RCMP officer leaves, life seems to relax, and contact with whites becomes a regular event. In the 1960s, the base bar opens, first to the men, and then to the women.
The base was for the white people, and in my mind, I think it was, if a Inuk could come to the base and be amongst the white people, he was becoming one of them. When I was 5, 6, 7, 8, I guess it started off all right. I guess I was happy for a while, and the people I was living with were happy at the same time too, but people started drinking. And I guess they got to drink more and more, and then they would say, there's another place where we used to live. They used to tell me that, but I couldn't really believe them, that there was another place on earth.
In a place like Resolute Bay, there is nothing to do. You could not go out. You could not go fishing or hunting for waterfowl because it is very cold, so one has to stay in the house all of the time. The only time a person can really enjoy the life there is when a person has an abundance of alcohol. Even if you people don't drink now, you could start to drink if you were moved up there. It's alright in a place like Inukjuak if one doesn't drink. But up there, it's best to drink. The only way to tolerate living up there is to drink alcohol.
I was born in Resolute and born and raised, and growing up in Resolute was not very easy for me. You had to be tough. You became tough person, tough kid. it wasn't easy. You lost your language, part of it. You were taken advantage of, and you were scared most of the time.
The kids grew up realizing that this was the way of life here. I mean, I went through hell, but some kids went through hell too. Sometimes from one house to another, we would be running away from fightings or drunks, and then we would go to another family, and there'd just be kids there and nobody else taking care of them. And one of the things I really remember is the stove was out. I didn't know how to operate a diesel heating stove. And I had my brother on my back and some kids around, and these kids were half naked. And they were freezing, eh? You could hear them moving their jaws. And there was no heat in the house, and this was in the middle of winter, in the dark. In school, we were taught the white way, the white culture. Being in school was stressed that the Inuk way was no longer the way. So these kids, us, wanted to be white, but our parents couldn't be white. It was, they had this something that we didn't know anything about that. They kept trying to preach us, but we didn't want to hear it. I guess in our mind was, we don't want to be like you. Look at you. I mean, you're drunks. When the people started drinking more and more, I guess the people at the base started to realize they could take advantage of this, that they could bring down the booze and womanize. It was never during the daytime. Like it was like a hush-hush sort of.
Some friends and ourselves were trying to be in somewhere that nobody will find us. And then when you have to go to sleep at night, you're with your friend, and then you would wake up intoxicated parents entering, and you want to sleep, but you can't. It was depressing. I mean, not fun at all. My impression of the history of Resolute is burden, small, isolated. What was that word? Fake community. That was my impression of how Resolute is. Portrayed honestly, portrayed.
So that ugly beast called intergenerational trauma rears its head again, and even after people in the communities eventually got their footing and day-to-day physical survival wasn't an immediate concern anymore, there was a lot of mental and cultural trauma that they dealt with for a really long time. From laying this all out, it should be pretty clear how very wronged Inuit were with these relocations. However, the next part we're going to talk about is the long fight to get the Canadian government to recognize these wrongs. So let's talk about that next. In the 1970s and 80s, some of the relocated Inuit returned to Inukjuak. This was also a really difficult decision because in doing so, they often left children and other relatives in the High Arctic, separating families again. And when these people returned to Inukjuak, they left behind everything they had before back in Grise Fiord and Resolute Bay. Things like boats, snowmobiles, household appliances. They had to rebuild from nothing again back in Inukjuak.
In the 1970s, the bar is finally shut down, and the people of Resolute gradually take back control of their lives. For many, this will mean going home. Even though Grise Fiord did not experience the same problems as Resolute Bay, many elders there also returned to northern Quebec. 1,400 miles away, the elders returned to their old community, which is now a large northern town called Inukjuak.
It was a happy event when we returned, because it was the way it used to be, for the stones to be warm and the plants to grow. So I was excited when we were about to arrive. But part of our lives, the people who were supposed to be here with us, the ones we have left in Inukjuak, had passed away. It could not be helped.
And until 1988, people who returned were doing it at their own expense. And Inukjuak, being a small, remote community, wasn't prepared for this influx of returning people, and the community wasn't given any extra resources from the government to deal with these changes. In 1988, the federal government finally offered to move these relocated families back to Inukjuak, and in 1989, 40 Inuit, mostly older people, returned to their home community. Many younger people, either people who had been born in the High Arctic or had been relocated there while very young, chose to stay in the High Arctic because they had known no other home. And although the government agreed to pay for transportation and some new housing, it refused to negotiate for further compensation for relocation survivors. They also refused to offer an official apology at this time.
In 1988, as a result of lobbying from several Inuit groups, the feds sponsored a return to northern Quebec. Around 40 individuals chose to return. Many younger Inuit chose to stay. Juadimi was a part of the younger generation. He was born a few years after his family was relocated from Inukjuak in 1953. He says there's a generational division between those born before and after the relocations.
So one of these northern Quebec elders saying, I went to my uncle Simeone and I asked him, which would you prefer, caribou or Arctic char? To my surprise, he said Arctic char. I want more Arctic char than I want caribou. Turn out in northern Quebec, if you really look at from the way high, there's a lot of little lakes. In northern Quebec Inuit, they survived on Arctic char quite a bit.
In 1994, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples published an extensive report on the High Arctic Relocations. And I went through it. It's about 200 pages. Fun fact, Mary Simon, who is currently Canada's Governor General, she is Inuk from Nunavut, she was an advisor on this commission, and she argued very strongly that relocatees get a chance to tell their story, which in my opinion is crucial for the report. And the report attempts to offer a pretty balanced view of what happened, looking at all the conflicting government and RCMP reports with Inuit oral testimony, but they do take Inuit oral testimony seriously, so that was good. They did this by having public hearings in Ottawa in 1993. They interviewed 33 Inuit. Some had been adults at the time of the relocation, some were children, and others were born in the High Arctic. My first thought was they made all the Inuit go to Ottawa instead of going up to the communities, but okay. And the commission also talked to former RCMP, former government officials, and a panel of experts on Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic. And the report gets into the policy details about was the relocation legal under Canadian law. They conclude that it kind of wasn't. And who was responsible for it? They conclude that it was mostly the Department of Northern Affairs. They also trace the funds used in supporting the relocation. There was a lot of sketchiness there because Inuit didn't get a lot of the supplies they were supposed to, and the funds weren't used or, tracked properly. Anyway, their main findings were pretty solid. They acknowledge most of the historical and cultural context that we touched on at the beginning of the video, as well as how poorly the relocation was planned out, and how Inuit were coerced and misinformed right from the beginning. And they conclude that the failure of the relocation was totally predictable. If the government had done its due diligence, they should have known that this would have happened. And although the reports find that the primary motivators for the relocations were social and economic concerns about Canada's Arctic sovereignty definitely influenced the decision to relocate Inuit.
Among the young people who returned to Inukjuak is Tommy Ikaluk.
The first time when I really woke up was when I went to Frobisher. There was this black guy that was working there. He made me realize by talking to me about life, about the white society, the black society, the whole world. I mean, he started to put things in my head that's, hey, I can be something different other than being a drunk and a troublemaker, and realize that what happened in Resolute wasn't right. He made me realize that there was a better way of life. No matter how much abuse and how much violence and how many deaths and suicides you have seen, if you know yourself, you'll be okay. And I realized that day that I didn't have to be bad, that there was another way of life. Maybe what my parents used to say in Resolute Bay, that there was a better place to live, a better way of life, maybe they were telling me the truth. And that day I woke up that there was something else outside, that I should be confident in the Inuk culture. Good points.
In 1996, the federal government put $10 million into a settlement fund to be paid out to surviving relocatees and their descendants. So each year, about 100, 250 people got a payment from the fund. However, after a few years, payments dropped dramatically. So for example, for the first 2 years, people would get like $10,000 to $15,000 a year. And after a while, it was down to like $200 a year. So not sufficient. I couldn't really find out why the payment dropped so much, except that it was an economic crunch, so make of that what you will. It wasn't until 2010 that the Canadian government issued a formal official apology, which was given by then Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, John Duncan, and he issued this apology in person in Inukjuak. And although the apology does acknowledge the government's wrongdoing, he does use the phrase sad chapter in Canada's history, which I am not a fan of because it seems to sweep everything kind of under the rug and imply that the chapter is now closed, when the effects of this trauma are still being felt by many people. The residential school apology had similar phrasing, so I don't know why Canada insists on implying that all of this is behind us, but anyway. Another acknowledgement of the relocations is that also in 2010, there were 2 monuments built, one in Resolute and one in Grise Fiord. And they face each other, which is kind of cool. The one in Resolute was carved by Simeone Amapuelek, who is a relocation survivor, and it depicts a lone man looking out at the ocean. It's put up very close to the actual place the relocatees were dropped off in 1953. The monument in Grise Fiord was carved by Ludi Piemini, and it depicts a woman with a young boy and a husky, with the woman soberly looking out towards the ocean. Grise Fiord and Resolute Bay are still communities today. Grise Fiord has a population of about 150, and Resolute has a population of about 230. And you know, people were born there, people call it home, and they are communities with very unique and very interesting histories. And all I can do is hope that the people affected by the relocations are able to find some peace and some healing.
Despite these experiences, Larry calls Grise Fiord home. It's where he grew up.
Yeah, this is home. I grew up here. This is the home that I know and have lifetime of friends here and people.
Yeah, I wasn't really affected other than by the fact that the stories that my mom and all the elders used to talk about in northern Quebec. Mm-hmm. I've never been there. This the life I grew up in, so it just became like home. Mm-hmm. And even though a lot of people would say, you know, it's really cold, but when you grow into an environment, we adapt to it, and basically that's how we survived. It's like.
And that's the end. That's where I'm calling it, at least. I thought for sure this would be shorter than my last video, but it's like a half hour longer right now, so I guess that's just who I am now. So I feel sufficiently frazzled and twitchy after finishing all of this, so I
go crazy.
Don't mind if I do.
I hope it was enjoyable. I noticed that I have 12 subscribers now, which I know it sounds silly, but hey, look at me go. I'm just happy if anyone watches this video and gets something out of it, so if you made it this far, I can't thank you enough. Also, I've been working on not popping my plosives, so I hope that's gotten better. For what's next, I have a few ideas. I'm actually thinking of doing a video analysis of the Fast Runner. It's been on my movie watch list for like a decade now, so I think I'll just take this as a sign to watch it and make a video about it. Not necessarily a review, but like a dive into the lore, as you will. And after that, I don't know. I think my next video essay will not be about Inuit issues, but could be about Indigenous issues, and will definitely be about some kind of unsettling social justice issue. But, you know, leave a comment of what you would like to see next. That would be super helpful and much appreciated. And yeah, take care, and I will see you in the next one.